Hello and welcome to the International Society for Physical Activity and Health podcast. Today's podcast is one in a series of 9 podcasts on the 8 investments that work for physical activity. The 8 investments that work for physical activity are a call to action for everyone, everywhere, including professionals, academics, civil society and decision makers, to embed physical activity in national and subnational policies. It's time to get into our podcast for today with your host, Matthew Tepi Mclaughlin. Okay, we're here today with Professor Jasper Schipperijn, President of ISPAH, and we had Jasper on the previous podcast, which was great, talking about active travel. We're here to talk about investment number 3, active urban design today. How are you doing, Jasper?
Thank you, Tepi. Thanks for having me.
So could you tell us a bit about the investment active urban design?
Yes. So active urban design is, it's related to active travel. It again has to do with how we plan our cities moving forward, where active urban design, it's more than just looking at the travel related design. It's also looking at where do we have our recreation spaces? Is there a green space? Are there sports facilities? Things like that as part of our cities that make our cities easy places to be active in, not only because we have to, because we're transporting ourselves, but also because we want to. So active urban design in this investment is very much about sort of our leisure time activities. How can we make those activities more active for more people in our cities in the future?
Yeah, that was going to be my first question, because I'm sure a lot of people were also thinking, okay, what's the difference between active travel and active urban design? And it seems that the urban design bit of it is about the places, like you were saying, the sports fields or the park or the school playground or whatever it might be. So
Exactly.
how do those influence our levels of physical activity?
Yeah, so there a whole series of studies from many different places around the world by now is showing that there is a clear relation with urban design and physical activity, where we can see that if there are more activity-friendly neighborhoods where there both are sports facilities, there are green spaces, but also more better facilities for active travel, and we see that people are more active. And I think a number of years ago, a study was published in the Lancet based on the International Physical Activity and Environment Network, the IPEN network. And in that study, we looked at 14 cities around the world, and very different cities on different continents. And there we found that in the most activity-friendly neighborhoods, people were 70 to 90 minutes more active per week than people living in the least activity-friendly neighborhoods. And to put that in perspective, 70 to 90 minutes per week, that is about half of what the weekly recommendations for physical activity is. So simply by where you live, people could have significant contribution to their weekly physical activity. So by the urban design, by creating more activity-friendly cities with good places to be active in your leisure time, activity comes natural, so to say.
Yeah, I think a lot of people in the COVID-19 pandemic would have kind of realized their proximity is maybe good or bad to somewhere to be active.
Exactly. And it also, what shows is that, for example, the question of whether or not we should have green space standards for cities has popped up again, because all of a sudden some of the larger cities are discovering that when they due to COVID among other, encourage people to meet each other in public parks, when people actually start doing that in a large city, then all of a sudden you discover that there are not enough square meters of park for people to do that. there's simply not enough space. So, and that's an idea that in some countries in the 60s and 70s, you had these norms. There was a certain amount of square meters of green space that was required, similar to some cities nowadays having requirements for parking spaces, which obviously is not a good thing from a public health and physical activity point of view. But so, yeah, having requirements for green space, having requirements for how many recreation facilities there should be within a relatively close distance to people are some of those things that would be really interesting to study moving forward.
Yeah. So I've got another question. Is it just the bigger things like the parks and the proximity to those, sports fields or whatever it might be, or is it also those building design things or those smaller things? A classic example I'm thinking of is if you make the stairs really attractive and you put the lifts at the back of a building, those that are able to tend to take the stairs.
Exactly. Yeah, so it is also the smaller things. And I think when the stairs and lifts example is definitely one of them that is very well known. But a similar simple thing is, for example, local planning regulations or planning codes requiring that the ground floor of new buildings has attractive shop fronts or restaurant windows. So, for example, requiring that the ground floor cannot be a closed facade. That's one of those things. And why is that? Simple because if there is something interesting to look at, people will also be looking out and both looking in, which means that the experience of walking there will be more pleasant and for most people perceived as safer and so on. So there are a lot of simple things. Also, for example, creating a mix of functions, so land use mix as it's called, where you make sure that you try to integrate as much as possible residential property with commercial property, with shops, with restaurants, with leisure time, so that things are mixed. So again, there's life in the city streets at different times of the day, different groups of people being there at the same time. All those things together also help to make it a livable city where people like to be. So yes, you can create certain facilities specifically designed for people to be active in, but also if you make the whole of the sort of the urban morphology, you can call it, I guess, a more attractive place for people to be and to walk around in and to live in, that again stimulates more activity, both in leisure time, but also transportation related.
Yeah, I think that one, it does take a little bit more thinking through and working out, doesn't it? But once you've kind of thought it out, if somewhere looks nice and is attractive and there's good lighting and there's other people there and somebody's sitting out having a coffee on the street, you're more likely to want to be in those spaces and moving around by your own means. Yeah.
Exactly. And it is, I mean, from various playground studies, we know that the single most attractive feature on any playground that makes children want to play there are very simple: other children.
Yeah.
And though that's the single most attractive feature, and to a certain extent that holds for adults as well. So if there are other people, a space becomes more attractive. So figuring out how to create spaces that work for multiple people at multiple times of the day for different facilities or for different functions is really one of those crucial things. And again, this is an area where as public health experts or as physical activity promotion researchers, it's not necessarily our key expertise that comes in. Yes, we know quite a lot about behavior change. Yes, we can study the effects on public health, on physical activity, but how to make some of these things actually happen in reality, we need to work with a lot of other professions and planners to figure out, okay, how do we do this? How do we make this happen?
Yeah, yeah. No, I was thinking of another example whilst you were talking there. It's the design of shopping centres, and we use this example here that you don't put the car parking down the middle of the indoor shopping centre, because nobody would be there. There would be no people. And what makes
Exactly.
those places attractive is there is no parking in the inside. So people want to be there.
Exactly, and it is in a way, and I know this might sound controversial, but in a way, shopping malls are designed quite well if you just look at the indoor spaces, because they are on a human scale, a lot of shops close to each other, everything is within walking distance. And to be honest, if you look at how much people walk actually quite a lot inside a mall. The only big problem is you need thousands of parking lots around it because they're typically built somewhere very remote. And and that is also I think one of the most drastic planning requirements that has made a difference in Denmark, where I work and live, for our inner cities, is for many, many years, it was not possible to, from a planning perspective, you could not get planning consent to build these very large buildings. So this having like a 10,000 square meter building with shops inside, for many, many years, you could not get building permission for that.
Mm.
And such a relatively simple regulation has been meant a lot for how city centers have developed. So sometimes it also these rather odd rules that seem to make a big difference.
Yeah.
So that's again one of those things we need to look at, I think.
Having those people outside of health invested in is probably not necessarily for the benefit of physical activity. It might be for the benefit of a historic city or a town that's wants to improve its businesses. And the co-benefit is, there is actually some extra physical activity in there.
Exactly, and I think that's one of the interesting research perspectives in this, is to figure out, how do we study the co-benefits? How can we design good research projects where we're not only evaluating effects on physical activity or public health, but we're also looking at historic connection to a city center or building preservation, but potentially also more CO2 reduction or air pollution reduction, climate mitigation, things like that. How do we combine those things and have a research project that makes sense, but at the same time also an implementation? So how do we implement projects together with city planners, city politicians, where we try to think in terms of co-benefits and do the things that make sense for many different policy fields? I think that's one of those key messages here. And I guess that again, from a research perspective, also from an implementation perspective, why don't we just do that? Because it's hard. It's difficult. When you are trying to involve many different groups, you need to figure out, well, what is actually the problem, and well, what could the solution be? And when you are in the sort of the wicked mess problems, and they're difficult to solve.
Yeah, that seems like a nice wrap up, and talking to what needs to be done. So have you got anything else to add to that, Jasper?
I'm not sure if there's much to add, to be honest there. No, I said, work together with other disciplines, figure out how we can implement this. Again, similar to active travel, I think we know it works if we can get it built. But how do we get it built? How do we realize some of these things on a larger scale? And I don't think we've quite sort of cracked that nut yet at this point in time.
That nut or that system?
That nut or that system, probably, again, as we talked about before, systems thinking, all these different integrated parts. As a health researcher, I also know that evaluating that type of studies, especially with our more classic research designs, that's not going to work. You're never going to do a random controlled trial with that. And I'm not saying that's a problem, but it's definitely something for us as researchers to be aware of, that we probably need to think other study designs and other ways of considering evidence for this type of studies.
All right, great. Thank you for that, Jasper.
Well, that brings us to the end of today's podcast. But if you haven't done so already, I'll encourage you to subscribe to your favourite podcast channel. The International Society for Physical Activity and Health podcast is available on all of the leading podcast channels, including Apple, Spotify, Google. If you've got an idea for a podcast, you can send that through to info@ispah.org. Thank you very much for listening, and we hope you can join us on our podcast again soon.